Thank you. And I'm Bernie Octor with National Institute of Justice. Glad to be here. And welcome to all of you from your many different organizations. And do I hear it? Is it working? Wanted to thank the National Council as well as OVW for hosting this. It's very much appreciated, I think. And to Barbara for getting it out beyond this locale, and also to folks in Reno. And just a quick word first about NIJ and OVW have done many things collaboratively over the years. And this, to me, is certainly an excellent one to show as a good example of our collaboration. And there'll be many more of them. And then at the local level, like in Lexington, Kentucky, there's a great collaboration going on right there. With Terry and TK, and we'll hear much more about that. So today TK is going to present for about 40 minutes, and then Terry will have about a 10 or 15 minute follow-up, and then we'll have a half hour of discussion and Q&A as well. Hopefully it'll get into, okay, what do we do with all of these research results now? How do we apply them? So with that, and there, Terry Farragher is the executive director of the Domestic Violence Prevention Board in Lexington, and TK is a professor at the University of Kentucky and has been for a number of years, and also author of many scholarly articles on stalking and sexual assault, and a number of books as well. And their more detailed bios are in one of the handouts that's outside here on the table. So with that, I'd like to ask TK to get us started.
Well, first of all, I want to say thank you so much for having us here and for the opportunity to share some of the findings that we have from the Kentucky Civil Protective Order study. I want to first talk a little bit about, well, I also want to thank you, Aaron, I have a lot of animation, but I'm going to have Aaron be advancing for me, so I apologize up front, and thank you too. I want to start out with a little bit about where my motivation for this particular study came. I was doing another study and using women with protective orders as sort of a sampling frame, and studying health and mental health and substance abuse and how that changed over time with victimization and other kinds of victimization. I didn't know much about protective orders at the time. I thought I did, but I was in for some schooling, and I got a lot of schooling and realized I really didn't know much about it. And also there was a huge disconnect, if you want, for me. We studied in that particular study over 750 women from multiple jurisdictions, rural and urban, and we did a 12-month follow-up. And what we found in that study was 40% of the women reported there were no protective order violations. Now, this was not a protective order evaluation study, but at the same time, I was hearing from judges all the time, oh, women just come back and drop the order. I found 9% in that sample drop that order in that 13 months post protective order. Women come back, they're always changing it. I found about 20% went back for amendments. And there were a few who went back and forth kind of amendments. Victims advocates were telling me it's just a piece of paper, it doesn't work. And then you look to the media, and there are always these stories in the media about the failure of a protective order. So these things were just not making sense to me. You know, I had the women, the survivors over here, telling me some difficult stories, some of them talking about the barriers to get the protective order, what they had to overcome, talking about some nightmare stories on enforcement. But overall, these women had better lives after the protective order, so it just wasn't fitting for me. And that's where the motivation for this study came, just from some questions. So the first question is, how effective are protective orders? So I went to the research. Guess what I found in the research? Anywhere from 20 to 70% of protective orders are violated. Now, I personally didn't find that very helpful, actually. And of course, there's all these methodological differences. So If you look at it from official data, it's going to be much lower than if you talk to survivors. And also that question, how effective are protective orders, is actually a little more complex than just looking at violations. And I really couldn't find one study that kind of gave us the bigger picture. Second, under what circumstance, if protective orders don't work for some women, what are those circumstances? What are those factors associated with violations? Oh, here's my big one, and I'm not saying I have answers to this, but if protective orders work, then how can we talk to the justice system, the criminal, civil, and criminal justice system, so they can do more of the good stuff and improve on the areas of weakness? And I thought and thought and thought, because I had presented some of the findings from the earlier study, and they thought it was interesting, but didn't seem that much changed. So that's where the idea for a cost. What we had done in the past, I had worked with an economist way back, and we did a study on outcomes of drug court. And I really saw a huge transformation when we looked at the costs and the avoided cost society with that all over the state, including the justice system, as well as legislatures and everything. So I thought, well, why can't we apply that to protective orders? And I wrote that in as a big piece. And then finally, like I told you, we were looking at rural and urban women in that first study. And I felt like there were differences, but there's nothing I could put my finger on. It was very difficult to measure. I couldn't find anything number-wise, really. And then when I went to the literature on rural experiences of partner violence, they would say, well, you know, we found these trends, this is why it's different. But I would be like, but we saw some of that with our urban women as well. So I really wanted to do a much better job at comparing rural and urban, not just victims' voices, but also trying to look at community context. So we also did key informant interviews. We used secondary data, other kinds of research we could get our hands on. Because the rural area that I've looked at, that we looked at in this study, it's the Appalachian rural area. So it's a kind of a unique cultural tradition, and so there's a lot of writing on that. And so that was really nice to integrate some of that to help us interpret our data as well. But first, of course, nobody else would have funded a study like this, so I have to thank the National Institute of Justice. Bernie Octor, who also is like really supportive and helpful through the whole process. Of course, there wouldn't have been a study unless their survivors were willing to talk to us and to tell their stories and to sit with us. The baselines were 3 or 4 hours. We did a 3-month and a 6-month follow-up. We had the 6 months, we had a 99% follow-up rate. So they stayed in touch with us. We were able to get their stories. We also worked with community advisory boards at the initiation of the study and throughout the study. But there were others also in the community that made the study possible that weren't necessarily on our community advisory board. For example, judges who allowed us as guests into their courtroom. That's where we recruited women. And of course, I had my co-authors on this study, Terry Farragher, who's here, Robert Walker, and William Hoyt, who is actually the economist that analyzed and did all the voodoo on the cost data. And just to give you a little background, I've kind of already talked about this. In the write-up, I wrote it as 3 sub-studies, but in reality, it didn't work like that. It took me a month to figure out, because the study is so huge with so many different components that I did write it up as 3 sub-studies. The first one being sort of the contextual community differences. As I talked about, we did over 200 key informant interviews. We ended up with a final sample of 188 hour-long interviews with professionals. They gave us an hour on the phone to tell us their thoughts about how the process worked in their communities, what they thought the weaknesses were, the barriers, and that kind of thing. We used official court data. You're going to see some of that. We used other research, kind of talked about that, literature and news articles. And the other thing about our Appalachian rural area is it's actually gotten national media attention because of the drug use. The drugs have just torn those communities apart. The second sort of sub-study that we talk about in the report is the interviews with the petitioners recruited out of court, and we also got secondary court data that matched those cases, so we could kind of look at that. And then the third sub-study was really the cost component, which sounds really easy. Most of the data was gathered, the cost data was gathered from the interviews, but going out and attaching a cost to a specific service use and that kind of thing, that actually is a lot of groveling for data, which I'm willing to do, obviously. And I did find a great state source. I got most of our costs state-specific. There were a few national data sources I had to use because we didn't have state-specific. So just to give you a little background on who, before I get started on the effectiveness, I want to give you a little picture of what the population looked like. On average, women were about 33 years old. 80% had children. The vast majority of those children were under 18 years old. 27% had less than a high school education and no GED. And let me just say, I'm going to start with the overall picture of protective orders and then move into contextual differences, so I don't really want to talk about rural-urban differences, but on some of these I just can't help myself. That education rate did not vary by the rural-urban. Yes. 48% were unemployed at the time of the baseline. However, only 26% reported they had not had a job in the past year. And their median income was about $15,000, and that did not vary by area either. In Kentucky, we don't give protective orders for dating violence. You have to have been married or at some point to that violent partner, or to have cohabitated at some point. So about 50-50 here, married, cohabitate. And you can also have a child in common, but most of them met that boyfriend, cohabitant, or married. And then half had children, about half had children in common with that partner. And it's delaying on you. And just a little bit about the respondents. On average, they were 35 years old. And this is what I really want to hit, and I think you know a lot of this. This is not new in this study, but I just want to be very clear here. 78% had prior misdemeanor or felony charges, and of those, there were 9 charges on average. 63% had prior convictions, and of those with convictions, the average was about 7 convictions. 16% had prior DVOs against other victims in Kentucky, because I couldn't get data from other states, obviously. And this is from victim reports. 87% had ever been in jail, 25% ever in prison, but this is just one place I want to point out a rural-urban difference. 35% actually in the urban area had ever been in prison versus about 15% in the rural area. So do protective orders work? I can come up with at least 5 different ways to measure that. Are there violations? What's the violation, right? Any violations. If there are violations, is abuse reduced? Even if there are violations, can we see a difference? What is most associated with violations? We kind of talked about that. How do they impact the victim? Especially, in particular, fear of future harm, and then victim's perception of the protective order effectiveness. All right, so the first question, do they stop the violence? What we found is that half of the women experienced a violation, any violation in our 6-month follow-up, half did not. So now I just want to look at those half that did experience a violation and see, did it reduce violence? I'm not going to go into this is 6 months before, this first bar, this is 6 months after. And this is the number of women. So you can see there are drastically fewer women. Of those who experienced at least one violation in our 6-month follow-up that experienced threats to kill or harm, moderate physical, severe physical, rape, or threats or use of a weapon. And then of those that experienced any of those tactics, we looked at the number of times, the number of threats before and after, and those are significantly reduced as well. So what about the abuse? Things that might not technically meet a violation or that prosecutors would maybe take on as a violation. Psychological abuse, and this is any psychological abuse, any economic, what I call symbolic violence, sort of, shaking the fist or throwing something, or pets, child interference or threats about to or assault of close others. So again, we see a significant drop, and then it's the same pattern. Of those that experienced any of those abuse tactics, the number of days they experienced them much less from pre to post. So then we did a couple of multiple regressions to look at what factors are associated with protective order violations. And so we wanted to account for as much, I mean, you go to the literature and some of the studies say children in common was a big difference, his criminal history involvement, prior severity of physical violence, sexual violence, and all of that. So we accounted for all of those things, the area, his age, race, whether or not they had been married to the partner, the number of years in that relationship, whether they had kids in common, and then how many days they had spent in the relationship after the protective order, because you might hypothesize that he would have more access and that would increase violations. Physical abuse severity, sexual abuse, and stalking. And what we found, both in predicting any violation and the number of violations, is that stalking is strongly associated with violations. And just to give you an example, what I started doing after I realized that is that realizing there are basically two kinds of violation groups, and it was about 50-50. 50% of the women who said there was any violations reported stalking, 50% did not. So of those who experienced any violations but no stalking, they reported an average of 7 violations versus 18 for those who reported violations and stalking. Let's look at fear of future harm. And this is, we adapted Dutton's fear scale. And so it looks at fear in a variety of different domains: threats and harassment, fear of physical injury, fear of public humiliation, which is a big one, fear of financial interference, fear of control, continuing to control her life, fear that he would hurt or harass others, and child interference for those who had children under 18. And you can see from before to after, fear levels are greatly reduced. However, let's look at it by violation group. So that first bar, no violations. That second bar, violations but no stalking. And then you see those being stalked, significantly higher fear levels. And that makes sense. Perceived effectiveness. The vast majority of women, this is no violations and any violations. The vast majority of women felt that protective order was fairly or extremely effective. But again, when you look at the three groups, you can see that the stalking victims felt that it was less effective, even though, almost 70% are still saying it's fairly or extremely effective. All right, so that's our 5 questions. So then what we did was turn to the economic analysis. So I worked with the economists to figure out, and the literature, what costs do we want to include? So the first one was service use, health, mental health, victim services, for example. A big cost associated with intimate partner violence, whether or not there's a protective order involved, is the criminal justice cost. Her talking to the police, whether there's charges, convictions, whether he spent any time in jail, and attorneys, private attorneys and legal aid were incorporated. What we call lost opportunity, so any time she lost from work due to the abuse, any time she lost civic or family responsibility time, and also we looked at volunteer activities that she might have missed. It was very low. We also took into consideration transportation costs and property loss due to the abuse. And then finally, we looked at this health-related quality of life loss. The reason we did that, or I became very, very adamant that we have to incorporate that into the cost, and all of you who work in the field know why. But methodologically, the way we collected this cost data is we took a calendar and we had the participant put for each month, 6 months before and 6 months after, what are the important dates to you? What holidays, what birthdays, kids start school, anything we could anchor. And then we had her put down service use due to the abuse, because we were trying to parcel out preventive health visits and all of that kind of thing, trying to keep it specific to the partner violence. Mental health each month, how many times in each month. And we also did that for a number of tactics. And what you saw on this calendar is, for most women, some women, there was a consistent dark line across for moderate violence or severe violence, but for most women that was sporadic. What was like black lines all the way across: psychological abuse, degradation, humiliation, just this daily grinding her down, basically. And so I took those calendars to the economists, and I just said we have to account for quality of life. So we ran the analysis both with quality of life incorporated and not incorporated, but I'm really only going to talk about it with that. And the other reason for looking at that diminished quality of life, for the number of days you're stressed, depressed, or anxious because of the abuse, is because it is a major chronic stressor, which we know is related to health and mental health, substance use, lack of sleep, lack of nutrition, and service use. Then we had to go back and cost out what is the cost of a protective order. And we had done this before in the drug court study. So what we basically did was take that and redo it. And we broke down every single step in the process. In Kentucky, which is very similar to other states, you first go down and file for emergency protective order. It's good for about 2 weeks. During that time, a hearing is set. Usually it's set right at the time of the petition, so she knows, but then the respondent has to be served with that protective order, and then they come to a hearing for the domestic violence order. And so we looked at that and the number that had more than one EPO, how many EPOs on average. And we also incorporated amendments, and we did the same thing, broke it down. And we worked with the administrative office of the court, the sheriff's office, the court system, just to kind of get all the costs right. And they were pretty much the same as what we had found before. So when the economist got done, I did all the work, but he did the analysis. It is true. But when he got done, what we saw was that this is per petitioner. There was a difference of about $4,500 per petitioner, and the overall cost of the protective order was about $354. So when he took that information and translated that, so for every dollar spent on the protective order intervention, there was about $30.75 in avoided cost to society. This is including that quality of life indicator. But then I broke it down by violation group, and you can see that it's a much lower return for those who experience stalking. And then what we did is extrapolate these findings to the state population of protective orders that were issued in fiscal year 07. We adjusted for 15% for male victims or same-sex victims because their service use and just all kinds of things could potentially be different. And when we did that, we found that in a one-year period, protective orders saved the state about $85 million. Again, when you look at it by group.
People are aghast.
Oh, okay. I just thought maybe there was a question.
There was a fellow Kentuckian that was asking.
All right. But again, what you see, as you would expect from the earlier numbers, is that when there's stalking involved, there's a much lower return. So, in summary from this, protective orders are making a difference in many women's lives. I mean, I just feel strongly that this data shows that. They cost very little in comparison to the suffering and the cost that victims are bearing, and that partner violence is costing society. Again, we just talked about this, that saved the state about $85 million. We think this is an underestimate, actually, but and we saw that victims appreciate that order, and by the way, only 4% dropped that order during that 6-month follow-up. Partner violence appears to be part of a pattern of criminal behavior. It's not necessarily an anomaly for many people. And stalking is a huge risk factor for not only ongoing violence, but also costs to the justice system, to victims, and to society. So what about community context? Let me just, before we get into this, because I'm going to look at the similarities and then look at the differences between rural and urban, and I kind of talked about this before, but what was really important for us to do is to compare. When you look at rural trends, what I've come to believe is you have to have some kind of comparison in order to say this is uniquely different. 2, I think you have to look at multiple kinds of data to really feel clear that there is a difference, sort of data triangulation, if you will. So those are the 2 things. So similarities, there weren't differences by age, income, or education. We kind of talked about that. Both groups experienced significant barriers, as noted by the key informants as well as the victims. There's a severe history of violence in both groups. There were no differences in perpetrator criminal justice system involvement history. There were no differences in the effectiveness of the protective order. It didn't matter whether they're in the rural or urban area. Half experienced no violations. Stalking came out as a strong predictor. And there were no differences in rural-urban by perceived effectiveness. Enforcement could have been stronger in both areas, and this is both from the victims as well as the key informants. And overall, costs did not vary. There were some little costs that did differ, some individual costs that differed by rural-urban, but the overall costs did not differ. What are some differences? Rural women were more entrenched in the relationship. They were more likely to have been married to that partner. They were more likely to have children in common with that partner. They were in the relationship longer, and they were more likely to have been unemployed at the baseline interview and to have had no jobs in the past year. What's interesting to me, too, that kind of gives you a little bit of picture about how the process works in the rural area. At the EPO incident, more rural women were separated at the time of that incident. More rural women stayed separated from that partner during a 6-month follow-up. And of those that did get back together in the relationship, they were in that relationship for fewer days on average than in the urban area. Again, history of violence. Both groups had severe histories of violence, but there are 2 main differences. In the rural area, it looks like the perpetrator just brings people into it. These are child interference threats, threats to harm others, actual threats toward others, and then weapons. Threats with a weapon and actual use of a weapon was different in the rural area. Barriers, and this is, I'm going to talk about barriers from the key informants. And this isn't really surprising if you know the cultural kind of history in the Appalachian rural area, but drug and substance-related crimes and abuse were like #1 priority consistently, not just from criminal justice system representatives, but also from victim services. And that was consistently different from the urban, where partner violence was really high. And I asked it a lot of different ways. There are also some indication from the key informants, and I'm going to show you some secondary data that also confirms this, that access to protective orders and to protective order enforcement is more difficult. First of all, there's the perception on both groups, victim services and criminal justice, that those of the women who petitioned for an EPO, on average, fewer would receive the actual DVO than in the urban area. And there were other kinds of barriers that were more negative and blaming attitudes toward victims, about partner violence, sort of more traditional gender roles. Politics plays a much bigger role in the rural area, sort of who you know, good old boys system came up as a theme. And enforcement, when you compare key informant answers, just seemed to be a lot less assertive. Okay. This is some actual data. So this is non-service rates from the Kentucky State Police. And so what that means is the rate of which protective orders, EPOs, were not served to the respondent. Across the 5 years in the urban area, I collapsed 5 years just to get a more stable picture of this. 22% in the urban area were not served, compared to about 55% in the rural area. And let me say, we had 4 rural counties, and that ranged from 22% in one county up to 80% in another county, a big county, not a remote, tiny little county. And charges, what we try to do to adjust for the population differences is look at the rate of a charge per 1,000 people. So what we didn't see a big difference for assault in the 4th degree domestic violence. However, we saw a difference with protective order violation charges, about 0.49 per 1,000 people in the rural area versus 1.1 in the urban area. And then stalking charges were so low, we didn't do it by 1,000 people, but 9 versus 87. So then I looked at some disposition data from the Administrative Office of the Court. And this is the urban area. And this is our first charge here is assault for domestic violence. And this is about 61% end up with a guilty. Violation of a protective order is this middle one, about 71%. And stalking in the 2nd degree, which is a misdemeanor charge in our state, you can see that we're not doing as well. More are dismissed and less are found guilty, about half. Here's the rural area, and you can just see by looking at this. Look, these two are the dismissals. So across all 3 kinds of those charges, much lower guilty and 0% found guilty for stalking charges in the rural area. So just victim barriers, we did find also some significant differences. Urban women talked about trouble navigating the system, understanding, confusion, not really knowing who to ask questions. Urban women also talked a lot more about the fear and the actual being uncomfortable facing the perpetrator in court than rural women. Rural women talked about getting more of the runaround. They actually had to carry their papers to the sheriff's office to have it served, or they had to go find the judge themselves. So they actually had a lot of legwork, a lot more legwork than our urban women, and more problems related to politics and judge rudeness. And just as an example, rural women spent about 3.5 hours on average to get the EPO versus about 1 hour and 42 minutes for the urban women. And another kind of trend, 90% of rural women received no contact orders versus 60% of urban women. And this comes up as an important point a little bit later, that trend. What about fear of future harm? And this is at baseline. And you can see across every single one of the categories, rural women are much more afraid. And they had more sustained fear at follow-up. It is lower, but it is still higher than in the urban area, but it is lower than obviously from baseline follow-up. Let's look at some enforcement numbers. Okay, for the EPO incident, 74%, this did not differ by area, reported they talked to the police about the incident. 45% of urban women perceived or reported there was an arrest for that EPO incident versus 18% of the rural women. Violations, like I said, did not differ. However, the average number of violations differed. There was an average of about 9 violations in the urban area and 15 in the rural area. And so of any violation. 65% of women who experienced a violation said they reported that violation. And we did a rough estimate. Urban women reported about an average of 74% of violations, while rural women reported about 31%. This is sort of the funnel. So 50% experienced a violation, 65% reported it, 27% overall were arrested, so 63% of the urban and 37% of the rural. And then of those that perceived there was an arrest, in the official data, 92%, there was actually a charge, a domestic violence related charge, versus about 43% of rural. So overall, can't see that, 38% of urban victims with reported violations believe there was an arrest versus 19% of rural victims. So this next slide shows official data, and it's only of those who said they reported violations. Then I looked at their official data. So what it does is take out whether or not she perceived there was an arrest. That's sort of the difference between two slides here. Half in the urban area said there was any kind of domestic violence charge, narrow, assault, force, violation of protective order, or any stalking charge, versus 5.6% in the rural area. All right, so enforcement, and then we took the violations and violations plus stalking, and so this is of those with said they reported a violation. 50% in the violation group showed up with some kind of narrow domestic violence charge in the official court data, and 64% of those with stalking had some kind of official domestic violence charge in that 6 months, versus 15% in the rural area with violations, but 0% of the violations plus stalking in the rural area. We asked, why do you think that, if there were any violations in any period that we talked to them about that were not reported, we asked them, why did you not report? And this is the table showing for the violations but no stalking group and violations post-stalking. And you can see the vast majority of women, if they didn't report, they said it because they didn't think the criminal justice system was going to take it serious. However, the violations group, but no stalking, 43% said because it wasn't that serious. But that's not really what the stalking victims say. They're saying there was no point or there was no proof, and there's a lot of bureaucracy. So, in summary, let's see. Actually, I'm going to skip this because I'm running out of time, and I want to get to some of the, well, here's one discussion question. I still don't know how to talk to the criminal justice system, so if y'all have any ideas about how to do that, we'll talk about that. So there were a couple of gaps in victim safety that we identified. One in particular was this between the EPO and the DVO. It was a mess. It was a mess to tease out. Women didn't realize that, first of all, it was no contact. They didn't know when he got served. They didn't know what constituted a violation. A lot of them needed to talk about children, so was that counted as a violation or not a violation? They didn't know how to report. Should I call the police? Should I wait till the hearing? So it was just a huge confusion for them. So we came up, Terry and I and the other co-authors kind of came up with a couple of ways for us to maybe look at that is a better explanation of the process at the EPO point. Follow-up or more assertive advocacy at that EPO, in between the EPO and the DVO. If you're having a horrible time at the EPO, why would you come back for the DVO? If it's not working for you or you don't understand, why would you? And, of course, we have this great thing now that we unfortunately didn't have this at the time of the study, is the Divine Protective Order notification that will let women know when he gets served. If she registered. Of course, enforcement needs to be strengthened across both areas, but especially the rural area. And we also asked victims, why do you think he didn't violate the protective order? If there was a period And they believe, the vast majority believe, because he's afraid of getting in trouble with the law. So the teeth are there. But if he gets away with it one time, then he becomes potentially more empowered. There were 3 main situations where enforcement was especially difficult. When there's confusion about primary aggressor, when the offender has fled the scene, and in cases of stalking. And of course, stalking. We need to address it at all levels, not just with the criminal justice system, but at all levels. These women were very frustrated that she didn't know what to do. She was at a loss. Sometimes they got the same old advice, like change your routine. Well, in a rural area, that's kind of hard to do. Even in an urban area, if you work and you have kids and they're in school, I mean, it's hard to do. So they were frustrated at all levels. Not really. And also just want to point out, not only was there more violence and abuse, more victim fear and distress, and more victim property damage, and I didn't really show this, but in another analysis, what I showed was that those with violations but no stalking had on average about $15 in property loss during the 6-month follow-up versus $600 for the women. This is per petitioner for women who experienced stalking. And, of course, address barriers, the navigation and confusion. Gatekeepers was a big one that came up, and I'm not just picking out court clerks. It could have been a police officer. It could have been the judge at the EPO point. The gatekeepers were sometimes really very negative. And then, of course, biases that need to be looked at the community level. So, for example, one big one in the rural area was, oh, if she's dropped that order before, she's not likely to get another order. And I'm just like, okay, first of all, let's, if you give 90% no contact orders, she may think she's complying with the law. I don't know if she understands there's 2 kinds of protective orders you can get. So maybe she's coming back, or maybe, although we didn't see a lot of dropping, obviously, in our study, but maybe the women that they see coming back are dropping it because they feel like they're complying with the law, actually. Or they may be the more severe cases. So this is a huge bias that really needs to be addressed in the rural area. Then things like, she's a substance abuser, basically, and then in the urban area, they had some of their own issues like discrimination between mixed-race couples and undocumented immigrants. And we just saw lots of myths. You all know these, but, they're just, to me, distractions away from the fact that partner violence is about the systematic and deliberate set of tactics designed to erode someone's personhood, autonomy, and to live a meaningful life. So all of these myths and whatever you want to come up with, that women do it to gain the upper hand in divorce and all of that, are just distractions from what the real issues are. But I know I'm preaching to the choir, so. So barriers have to be connected to the community context, obviously. So how do you do that? One way might be to do a walkthrough. They're doing this now with substance abuse treatment where people are literally walking through the process. Professionals are and feeling, what is it like to be on the other side of this? Or at least to carefully examine at every decision point. What are the barriers, the unique barriers with prosecution? What are the unique barriers with police officers? What about the gatekeepers? This is create systems of feedback and accountability. In Kentucky, we don't have any way for a victim who's been turned away, where a clerk told a woman that the law changed recently, and even though she lived with him for 7 years, she's no longer eligible. That's not true. But there's no way for victims to call and to say, this happened to me. Is this true? I mean, I want to lodge a complaint. This judge was very rude to me. The judge drug tested me when all I wanted was a protective order. And accountability, like what I showed. Let's do some data feedback. And increasing community collaboration, including with researchers. But at that point, I'll let Terry take over.
I'm going to begin by reassuring Judge McDonald that these studies weren't done in his jurisdiction. He's sitting there sweating, I know. He's worried about it, and I just wanted to reassure him. You're welcome.
The noise is because we lost connection. We'll be
Oh, okay, can I go?
Welcome to Eagle Teleconferencing Services. Please enter your PIN number.
I'll go ahead and start, though, because you've really seen the most important piece here, and there's not a lot of time, and so I really need to get through this quickly, which is why I'm going to stick to some notes here, because if I don't, I know Bernie wants me to make sure there's plenty of time for discussion and so forth, but, and I would echo all of the thank yous around this room for, everything all of you do. I've come to conferences, my entire career to see a lot of the people in this room, and I can't thank all of you enough because you've been my inspiration for 30 years and the only reason I've been able to continue doing this. And of course, particularly the NIJ for funding this study, OVW, and the National Council for all the support you give to communities like mine, because we couldn't do this work without you. I mean, it's just incredibly important. And I hope that that's obvious in the remarks in terms of some of the things that we're doing. Is there a clicker that I can use? I don't have, you have to do it. Okay. If you would just go to the first slide, that'd be great. So I'm just really quickly going to apply community context, talked about one of the areas for improvement, stalking in particular, and consider the relationship between research and practice for a few minutes. Go ahead to the next one. But I do want to start by sharing with you a segment of an article, and I'm not going to read this whole thing, but that was on the front page of our newspaper September 13th. I'm talking about this September 13th. That was just like a week or two before this study was released on the NIJ website, and the article is in reference to the murder of a 29-year-old woman named Amanda Ross, who was shot 2 days earlier as she left her apartment for work. A 55-year-old former legislator and gubernatorial candidate, Steve Nunn, has been charged with her homicide, and both Ms. Ross and Mr. Nunn are from very prominent families in Kentucky. As I said, I'm not going to read this whole thing, but the part that I really wanted you to see, the article begins by talking about how his life went into a downward spiral after the death of his father, the loss of his job, and the issuance of the protective order. But the part I do want to read is that his attorney, or an attorney, Estrida Lumpkins, who said she is a friend of Nunn's and was co-counsel for Nunn during a court hearing about the domestic violence order, said the issuance of the order, quote, caused all the problems. It caused Steve Nunn to lose his job, reputation, and drove him to slit his wrist. If there does turn out to be a relationship between the death of Amanda Ross and Steve Nunn, it's not because the DVO failed, but rather because the DVO was issued. Lumpkin said Ross should have also been held accountable for her role in the domestic violence incident. Things are not black and white, she said. There's a lot of gray in there. And the quote is, you can imagine the collective blood pressure in our community escalated significantly after these comments were in the paper. And while these comments, of course, were very provocative for all of us, I'm sure very painful for Mrs. Ross's family and friends, they were particularly devastating, I believe, for victims of domestic violence who were either considering getting a domestic violence order or maybe already had one. This case has received and continues to receive considerable attention for many different reasons, but these remarks in particular did prompt a hailstorm of response from the community in the form of editorials, op-ed pieces, interviews on talk shows and news interviews, and I'm probably leaving some pieces out, but in a whole variety of professionals in the community participated in those interviews and talks, and there was a lot of information that went out. It was serendipitous, honestly, that this protective order paper was released, right after these comments were in the paper, so that this recent data, along with the research that Dr. Logan had done for a decade, really then turned out to inform that discussion, and that was just critically important. So I've appreciated, of course, TK's work for the past 10 years, but I was never so appreciative of it as I was then. And as you can imagine, the information, the data she just presented were not easy to obtain. You know, it's not something I think all of us in this room can, you know, take on. It's a huge challenge. And she absolutely gets the lion's share of the credit for everything you saw, but the important piece from my perspective is that it grew out of and was informed by a collaboration with community partners. It really was a marriage or a cohabitation of research and practice. You know, in terms of how that helped us inform the discussion, go on to the next one. Of course, the fact that the protective orders are effective, that was the most important point that we wanted to get out there. But also just that perceptions are skewed, and TK talks some about that. But it is just so important for us at the local level so that our judges, our prosecutors, our law enforcement officers, and our advocates know what they're doing makes a difference. That is critically important. You know, right on down to the clerks, everyone. The next slide. Oh, and then also for the victims, of course, so that they have good information to make the choices and you know, do protective orders make every victim safer? We know, no, that's not true, of course, but we do want them to have good information when they're making the decision as to whether it will work for them or not. And you know, also those statements so much played into what perpetrators, of course, tell their victims, that they are above the law. Go ahead to the next one. So I want to talk just a minute about stalking and, you know, what this research has meant for us in terms of community practice. And I will say that some of what I talk about here, certainly we did get an arrest and enforcement grant from OVW several years ago. And so a lot of our efforts have really grown out of that project. But in 2005, TK did a presentation to our local coordinating council, and by the way, that is my job. I'm director of our local coordinating council. But TK did a presentation to my board, this coordinating council, and said that about half of the victims who obtain DVOs are stalked. And I still remember when she said that, sitting there thinking, okay, well, let's see, that means at least 500, 750 people in our community, just of the victims who get, you know, protective orders, are stalked. And, you know, then I started asking questions about how many charges do we have, how many prosecutions do we have of stalking, and I found that it was literally a handful, and that we really were not addressing it at all. In 2009, I have to say, you know, that was our wake-up call. The alarm is still going off, though. We still, you know that, and I'll, you know, tell you what we've done and what our success is with it. But, you know, we know how critical this particular tactic in intimate partner violence is, and that we need to really ramp up our efforts to address it. You know, in terms of the kind of things that we've tried to do specifically to address intimate partner stalking, I've got some of the things listed there, and I'm, you know, not going to go into detail about all of them. But again, we got the grant in 2006, and that's when we started these efforts. Everything takes time to get it up and running. But, you know, the training thing was critical, and we did put a lot of emphasis on that. And it wasn't just individual training of disciplines, but we hosted a statewide conference on stalking, the first in Kentucky. National Stalking Resource Center came down. They were great, a huge help. We also sponsored roundtable discussions in the community about it. And, you know, really that's probably in some ways the most critical piece, is just getting everyone to start recognizing stalking and being able to tease out stalking behaviors, which leads to the second point, the review of police reports. So we, you know, established a procedure where a sergeant in our domestic violence unit who looks at every single police report relating to domestic violence would, after the fact, if there wasn't a stalking charge on a case but the behaviors were obvious in that police report, then they would tease it out and slap on that stalking charge later. And then that also was training, of course, back to the patrol who maybe didn't identify it to begin with. Periodic reviews, you know, with prosecutors and law enforcement of just what the trends are, you know, what the arrest numbers are looking like, what's happening with those when they get to the prosecution level. More dedicated efforts to apprehend offenders, and again, some of this was through that grant, of course. Officers serving as affiants or affiants on warrants, which was a sea change for us. Now, some of you may have that in your community, but this meant that when they fled, when the officer got to the house and the offender had fled, because I think, they all knew in our community, run, because they're not going to come looking for you. So it meant we had to, put more effort into tracking them down. But also it meant that if they could establish any probable cause, they weren't going to be telling her to go down tomorrow to file that charge. They were going to go and be the FEN on the warrant before they ended their, whatever you call it, their time, before they were off for the day. Shift, thank you. Okay. Frontline advocacy for victims in our police department, we never had that before, so it was trying to get, offer that option at least to victims earlier. And then we also established a red flag committee so that we were already having multidisciplinary review of cases that were being prosecuted, but what if they weren't being prosecuted? But any community partner felt that there was an increased risk, maybe due to stalking. It could be other issues too. It could be substance abuse on the part of the victim, that placed them at higher risk. But then you could, call on this red flag committee to at least examine the case and see what alternatives they might be able to come up with. Currently, we have gotten a continuation on that grant, and so some of our newer efforts is, one of the things is that we really did focus a lot, just like that grant says, on increasing arrest and enforcement. But we have had some success there, but I think we need to look beyond that because not all stalking cases are going to result in an arrest and not all of them are going to be successfully prosecuted. And so, what I think we need to do now, we really had a strong focus there, but we need to look more broadly across the spectrum of services and be more assertive and creative in what we're coming up with, what else are we doing with to help victims be safer when they are being stalked. We are going to start safety checks. These are victims driven. They can select whether or not, after they've gotten a no-contact domestic violence order, whether they not want an officer to come by their house and do a safety check once a week, twice a week, for however long they might want that to happen, or the option of an advocate that is out of our shelter program, our domestic violence program. They can choose either one or none, whatever they want. We are looking at implementing a GPS pilot in Fayette County, and TK is very involved with that, and so luckily we will have good data on that from the start. We haven't really launched it yet. It's not that judges can't order GPS now, but of course this will, I think, intensify that make it more common practice. And we're still working on that though. Almost as we speak, arrived or anything, we still have work to do there, but it has improved tremendously. And maybe what's even more important is that second point, that stalking is being recognized by the community partners. We actually have had, a number of times where on hearing the facts of a case in court, a judge will say, well, isn't that stalking? This sounds like stalking behavior to me, even when there isn't a stalking charge. And this is in protective order hearings that I'm talking about. So it is being taken into account more by everyone, and particularly by advocates in safety planning. We all, of course, use multiple processes to evaluate our programs, and we all, I think, understand how important it is to do that. And this is just a list of some of the things we do, some of the processes we use, I think, to evaluate what we're doing, and they are all very useful. Go ahead, next slide. I'm not going to read through all of those. But generally, I think we do not have, at least I don't have the expertise or the time to conduct these kind of large-scale evaluations that you just saw. And I believe that, if we are only operating by what we believe works, that we really do run the risk of placing victims in greater danger. And I think it is particularly because we all know it is so individualized, and what makes one victim safer might place another victim in greater danger. And so, we always, the more information we have to help people make those decisions, I think the better. And of course, the relationship between researchers and practitioners are critical because of that. Of course, I work for a local coordinating council or a CCR, and I, personally believe for communities that have those, that they do bear a lot of responsibility accounted for holding the community accountable for their interventions. And I also think that they provide a logical forum for that communication, for bridging that gap between research and practice, because TK is on our council. I mean, she, can communicate with the whole variety of disciplines through that one venue. I thought a little bit about what makes this relationship work, because I've been in this field about 30 years, and I've worked with a lot of different researchers over the years who have done projects. But why has this one worked out better than any other relationship, at least that I've ever had, in terms of research and practice? And it really came down, I think, mostly to the things on this list, and the main one being the first one, the motivation of victim safety, having that trust that that's a motivation for doing the work. I mean, if somebody's doing a research project because they want tenure, I'm sorry, I just, I don't have enough trust then that it's not that it can't be good, and maybe if it has enough guidance, it might turn out to be great, but for a real relationship, for me, with research, I have to know that that is the motivation and have trust in that motivation. And also collaboration. I don't have a PhD, but, I have more experience in practice. So we come to the table, with different skills, different strengths, but we're at equal footing when we're at the table talking about it, and we can be honest and disagree with, with each other about things, and we do. I mean, we argue quite a bit about stuff, actually, but we hammer it out, and again, it goes back then to that motivation. What's your motivation? So, I do also think that the multiple perspectives that I'm biased toward the advocacy perspective, but I think we have to consider the perspectives of all the disciplines, when designing these kind of research projects and thinking about what the, what we will learn from them. And then, that last thing on there, that always having that standard to measure everything of what difference will it make for victims. Is it worth all the effort that's going to go into it? And you have to know it's going to make a difference for them. Of course, there are a lot of challenges in doing this too, and I'm sure many of you have experienced them. Egos, I think, that is the main challenge we all have. I mean, with ourselves even, but just in general, it's when you're trying to put something like this together and get people involved, that's a big factor. But crossing over that aisle, from academics to practice is a big deal too. And, for me to go to that table where I'm certainly less certain of myself and vice versa, you have to be willing to do that. The fourth bullet down, though, also is a great big one, because, of course, some people don't want to know what the outcomes are because they're afraid the outcomes might not look so good for them. So, you have to really bring your community partners along in that way also. And then maintaining that balance of influence, because neither one should drive the other. I mean, certainly they should be informing each other, but not driving each other, and that's really critical. Next one. So just in summary, I mean, certainly from my experience, that this relationship we have between research and practice has been very beneficial, and I believe has greatly benefited victims in our community, and I know it will continue to. Honestly, as I was listening to the presentation, I'm still learning from this study. I mean, I've been involved with it all along, but I keep finding new things every time I look at it, every time I hear a TK talk about it. So thank you so much for your time, and I think now we're going to have discussion, right? All right, thanks. You stay there.
Thanks to both of you. So who would like to open up?
Bernie, I have 3 questions from the field. Should I do those now? I need a mic.
Okay.
Thanks. Thank you. First question comes from New York. Fathers' rights claim that civil protection orders are given out like candy, which you alluded to earlier. In contrast, I've heard women or advocates complain that judges were not taking victims' reports of abuse seriously and frequently denying protection orders. Did they do anything to look at rates of requests that were refused or rates of conversion from emergency to permanent orders?
Unfortunately, no. This study, again, just looked at of those who got the protective order. That is a huge a gap, and especially now that, when we see just how chaotic it was between the EPO and the DVO, for those who actually went ahead with the DVO, that is a huge gap that we need more information about. But also, I think that there's some motivation in some counties maybe to, I don't know what they do with the denied petitions. So I just think it's a hard issue, and it is definitely one that needs study, but it would be like its own devoted study, because it would take a lot of time and energy to do.
Thanks. And now another question, this one from New Hampshire. Did you look at differences between victims who wanted protective orders to ensure no contact and those who wanted continued contact during the PO but felt safer having contact while the order was in effect?
This issue, from my perspective now, we've done 2 studies now, this issue of victims understanding no contact versus no violent contact, it's confusing. And one of the things we saw in the rural area is, although 90% were no contact, and then they would put a note on there, except for children, and then women don't always know what it is. So, to me, that whole no contact, no violent contact actually gets really blurry when you look at it over time for victims. So we did ask a series of questions about victims and their satisfaction with the hearing, whether they could ask questions. The vast majority felt that they had time to ask questions, that the judge asked them, do you have questions? Are there needs? The vast majority said they felt like they, again, not all of them, around 70, 75%. So we asked a lot of questions. I did not present that here today around that, about the DVO hearing. But we did not ask that specific, did you want to know contact, no violent contact, because what I really find is that women don't really understand, and even if they do, I feel like the judges kind of give what they want.
This questioner further asked, it might be that those not wanting any contact would be more likely to classify contact as stalking and thus be more likely to report violations. This might inflate the apparent difference in violation rates between stalkers and non-stalkers. What do you think?
Okay, I'm sorry.
It was a very complex question. It might be that those not wanting any contact would be more likely to classify contact as stalking and thus be more likely to report violations. This might inflate the apparent difference in violation rates between stalkers and non-stalkers. What do you think?
By reporting, you actually mean reporting to the researchers, because they didn't actually officially report it at higher rates, the stalkers, the stalking victims. And we also, we asked specific tactics of stalking, and the vast majority of these women were being followed, monitored, him showing up places. So, we really looked at his behavior and asked her about his behavior. Was it repeated, and did it frighten her? And that's sort of how we defined it, not whether or not she didn't want contact.
Question from Marilyn, from public health person. You mentioned some legal system barriers women faced to get protection orders. Did you get a sense for other types of barriers? Economic, fear for children, safety, disrupting their routine, etc.?
Yeah, there's a whole lot of inconvenience barriers and in terms of, again, our group of women are all women that got protective orders. So they persisted through and put up with the inconvenience and the other kind of barriers. And a lot of what we talked about when we asked about barriers from the key informants, a lot of them focused on the process and sort of enforcement. Those were the barriers that the key informants focused on and what most of the women actually focused on.
Questions or comments in the room here?
Yes. I was just wondering, did you look at the remedies that they got in the protection order besides no contact, like custody or whatever, and did you see any correlation between certain types of remedies that they got and the difference in their outcome?
We did ask the women what kind of remedies they got, but really the counties that we deal with, they don't really deal with custody. I mean, in general, it's small percent. They don't deal with any kind of support. That opportunity is there, but so I didn't really find a lot of difference between rural urban, and it was a small percent that did that. So I kind of focused on just whether it was contact or no contact. And then there was such a huge area difference there.
It's a question about technology and whether when you asked about stalking behaviors, if you also asked about electronic contact and communications.
We did. We just listened. Kentucky's a low-tech state. The stalkers don't need to use the technology. They don't. I mean, there's a few. There were some email. There were some Facebook slander. I mean, maybe one case of that. We didn't have anybody talk about a GPS. We had some spyware. But, I mean, these were very low, like anecdotal, like low in Kentucky.
No, just as we're going around there, if everyone could introduce themselves.
Thank you. I'm Don Farrell. I'm with the Bureau of Justice Statistics. I have a quick comment and question about your cost analysis, and it essentially comes down to the what do you do with that information practically? Now, in substance abuse treatment, it's pretty clear that treatment is more cost-effective than incarceration, and I think you can make an argument that that's getting through to policymakers and to criminal justice practitioners, and it may have an effect on their behavior. To play devil's advocate for a moment, I'm not sure if demonstrating that a protection order is cost-effective, is that going to change the behavior of criminal justice practitioners?
That was one of the questions I started with. Like, the question is, how do you talk to the criminal justice system? I came up with the idea of cost. I saw it make a huge difference with drug court, which is a combination of a justice system intervention, a criminal justice, a judge is highly involved in that, and some treatment. But, I mean, I saw a huge transformation with our costs. Why can't it make a difference? Like, why can't we talk about that? Will it make a difference? I don't know. I'm asking you. You know, you tell me. How can we talk to the criminal justice system to say, let's reduce barriers for women who ask for protective orders? I'm not saying all women should run out and get one. That has to be her decision. But if she asks, let's reduce it. Let's enforce these orders, because you know what? These guys are costing you money, and they're going to continue to cost you money.
I'm Rob Valente. I'm with the National Network to End Domestic Violence, and I just want to answer and say, I am just so excited to have this data saying that it does save money, because we're facing all kinds of things. The states are cutting budgets, and they're saying it's cheaper to close shelters than it is to, worry about, protection orders. They want to, if there's a specialized docket on domestic violence, they want to close that down and put it in the general court of general jurisdiction. And we're trying to look, we need this data to be able to explain to them, no, you're actually going to end up spending a lot more money if you do that. It's very important for the state coalitions to be able to share this information out. And I can also tell you that the people who write the check on the federal level, Congress, always ask, does it make any difference? We're spending all this money to encourage all these people to have that community coordinated response and get protection orders happening. Does it matter? And again, I'm just beside myself. I can't wait to run out of here. I want all your slides, and, and there's a lot that I want to do with this, so thank you.
Hi, I'm Sue Carbon. I'm a family court judge from New Hampshire, and I don't know who that colleague was who was reporting, but I wanted to follow up on a question, issue that you raised here about the differences between urban and rural. Can you detail a little bit more about why there is such a low rate of women who receive protective orders in rural areas versus those in urban? Did you define a little bit more what the differences were and why they were so much less likely to receive orders?
Okay, now this was the key informant. I don't know that, I don't have that data. This was key informant perception. So we went through every step of the process. Remember how I kept these professionals, judges like yourself, on the phone for over an hour. and literally walk them through almost every single process. And so one of the questions we asked is, okay, out of 10 women who get an EPO, how many of those do you think are going to end up with a DVO? And on average, across both the victim services and criminal justice system respondents, I think they said 4 out of 10 versus like 6 or 7 out of 10 in the urban area. So these were key community professional perceptions of access. I don't have that data. I wish I did. We don't have a system in place that will tell us, and that is one of the feedback loops, that we need to put in place. I would like a tracking system of every woman who asks for a petition, why it's denied. I mean, this should just be state instituted and fed back to the state, and then which can be used by county to look for anomalies and that kind of thing. But we don't have that right now. And right now, like I said, it's almost like they don't have to account for it at all. So I don't know what they do. Do they throw those denied petitions away? I know they're not supposed to, but
it would be really helpful if at some point you could do a study that could look at the content of what the petition is alleging, and then look at those which are, you did? Okay.
I did, between what the EPO and what the women told us in the research.
And those which are granted and those which are denied?
Oh, no, yeah. Well, again, accessing the denied petitions, like, do I trust that? I'm sorry, Judge. I mean, maybe you can, maybe you can.
And the judge actually... The judge is supposed to give the reason why Peter McDonald, retired judge from Kentucky, why they denied it. And actually, if it's denied, it's required by state law to set it for a hearing. I'm sure none of the judges do that, though. They still have to come back for a hearing. Oh, yeah, they do.
You don't have to have a
That's
hearing.
what they think, but the statute is pretty clear about that.
Everyone has the right to a hearing, right.
Yeah.
I understand that, and Judge Bowles talked about that, too, which was actually a surprise to me, another schooling in a moment. But what I'm saying is, do you agree that potentially there are counties where, what happens to those denied petitions?
It depends on where they originate. If they originate in the clerk's office, they should stay there. They should be in the file, just there.
Sometimes we can't even find from the clerk's office the actual petitions that were granted.
Well, it probably just varies from county to county, too, about what the practice is. If it's denied, they throw them away. They don't want to save them.
Exactly.
But they should be retained.
Yes. Yes, they should be.
Yeah.
Time for a couple more questions or comments. Reaction or statements on how this might be utilized
If I can just add one more thing, I really appreciate this study. This is enormously instructive and informative for us. We have a meeting that follows this to revise and update our Burgundy book on issuance and enforcement of protection orders. And there's an awful lot from this that we're going to take, I think now, and feed into that revised document. This is just incredibly informative. I really appreciate the quality and the time you spent doing this work.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate it. The worst thing for a researcher, right, is for the research to sit on a shelf and never go anywhere. So I'm always like, how can I make it more useful? And actually, a lot of the questions that we put on this interview came from the community.
Just so you know, most of the comments I got online during this were incredible thanks and congratulations, and this is wonderful.
Oh,
Echoing what Sue said, folks out there in the field are just very excited about this, and I think since we've recorded it, one person mentioned they want to listen to it several times and look at your slides and be sure they fully understand this so that they can use it with their own court system. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm sorry if I missed it. I'm sorry, I'm Denise Gamache with the Battered Women's Justice Project. I'm sorry if I missed it. Did you ask about firearms or removal of firearms as part of this process at all? And
About, I'm sorry,
removal of firearms as a result of an issued order?
We did not ask because in most of the counties, it's
It's a religion,
it's,
I know.
It's controversial, and it's also very controversial, and even if there was a stamp on it where they actually removed, and it's just very complicated, and actually, as Terry pointed out in a conversation with Bernie earlier, some victims don't even want his guns removed in Kentucky because if he can't go out hunting with his buddies, he's going to be sitting at home and mad. So, so it's really complicated. So we did not ask about that, but it's low. It's low. Hopefully that will change. There's legislation. I mean, this high-profile case has really spurred a lot of discussion in our state and a lot of changes. They're looking at a lot of changes, and that is definitely one of them.
Hi, I'm Mary Louise Kelly with the Family Violence Program at Health and Human Services. And I think this study is just stunning. I'm really, really impressed and just curious and hope that the information about how you costed out services and cost of services, I think we really need to know that.
Single-space report, basically. It's a book. We tried to be as open with everything that we did, and the cost study's not perfect. I'm not going to tell you it is. I mean, it's a start, and to build on that, and the economists and I worked really hard to do sensitivity analysis and with and without, quality of life, and the 90% confidence intervals, and we both wrote as much as we could in there. It's a lot of pages, just the cost piece of it. So.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.